So, welcome to session 2, and we're going to start in this first packet with the source of the Tanya. If folks are familiar with the Tanya, it's written by Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Anyone know who that is? Shneur Zalman of Liadi was the Alter Rebbe. He's the founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe of Lubavitch. And this was published in 1797. And really in Chabad, this is like the Torah. In Chabad, like, you learn Tanya. You know, if you ever meet a Chabadnik, he's going to say, like, come over for Cholent and learn Tanya with me. You know, that's what he wants to do. You know, so anyways, so Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, this is his introduction to his Tanya. And he explains we can only learn things in this context if we really want to. And to want to means we have to internalize it. It can't be external. It can't be academic. Here's what he says. It's well known and commonly acknowledged by all our colleagues that there is no comparison between the hearing of the words of Musar. Musar means an agitation for ethical development, and the reading of books which are read by the reader according to his own way and understanding. If his mind and mood are confused, walking in darkness regarding the service of God, he will hardly see the good light that is concealed in those books, sweet and soul-healing though it be. Also, books about piety, which are based on human intelligence, are definitely not appropriate for everyone, because not everyone is of the same mind, and what causes one person's mind to stir and become aroused will not affect another's mind in the same way. Even books about piety which are based on the holy sources, the Midrashim of Chazal, meaning the rabbis' teachings, in whom the Spirit of God spoke and His word was upon their tongue, and even considering that the Torah and the Holy One are as one, and all the 600,000 souls of the congregation of Israel, down to the last individual, even until the slightest spark of the simplest of our people, Bnei Yisrael, are all bound to the Torah, and the Torah binds them to the Holy One, as is known from the Zohar. But all this is true only in general terms. And even though, here's an important line, the Torah was designed to be understood in general, but also individually, by each particular soul of Israel rooted in it, still not everyone is able to know where is his individual place in Torah. Now, that was a really complicated way of saying that the conversation about the soul only works if one's soul is open. If one uses one's mind as an academic activity, the whole conversation is absurd. Right? We don't understand anything. It doesn't make any sense. We can't really grasp what we're talking about at all. So he wants to say, to enter this conversation, we have to bracket something which is impossible for us today, which is our modern-day skepticism, to some degree, to open our hearts and souls to embrace a certain reality in order to experience it. And that each of us, this is an important point, will have a different takeaway. We're not going to all walk out and be like, oh, I got it. Here's what Olam Haba is. Here's what the afterlife is. And we can all be on the same page with it. He's saying we're going to encounter lots of texts and traditions, and some are going to stick with us and some aren't. And so we have to kind of like take that, what's the analogy? Take something sticky and throw it on the wall and see if it sticks. What's the thing we're throwing? Pasta. Yeah, pasta. Yeah, exactly. See if the pasta sticks, right? Okay, against the wall. And that's going to require work, the Tanya wants to say. And that work means we can't have a third-grade theology anymore. Right? Most of us were told as we're falling asleep, there's this old man in the sky with a beard, right? You ever told that as a kid? I don't know, maybe no one told you, but you got it from the movies, you know? And we never really moved from that third-grade theology. Okay, there's a God, well, I don't know why. So we look out the window one day and we say, is there a God, is there not? Yes or no. Right? We don't actually investigate that in the depths. We remain on we get advanced degrees, but we remain as third graders theologically. And thus, it all seems absurd to us because we haven't developed this type of spiritual instinct. And yet also I'd suggest that we can't merely engage Pascal's wager. Everyone remember Pascal's wager? Pascal's wager was the basic idea that, look, there's a wager in this life. If I embrace God, if I don't embrace God and the right path, then, if I do, then I have eternal bliss, right? And if I don't, then I have eternal damnation. Right? It was a Christian way of thinking. I have eternal damnation or this eternal bliss. So I have a bet to make, and I might as well bet on the side that might give me the eternal bliss, because what's my loss if I'm wrong? Right? If I'm wrong and there really was no God, this stuff wasn't true, it was all whatever. Okay, so there's an eternity of nothingness. Fine. But if it was true and I bet wrong, well, there's an eternal loss at stake. So I would suggest that Pascal's wager won't suffice for us, because that still means you don't really believe it. You don't really embrace this as true and just and good, but rather I'm just going to place my cards on, place my chips on that space, and it has to be internalized. And we know the reason this is such an important topic for us is because who of us has not lost an important relative and has not wondered where they are, and has not wondered, can we connect to them? Some people have claimed those people we love who have passed have tried to communicate with them. I'm sure many in this room have felt that, either through words or through dreams or through intervention of animals that you've heard of, or leaves dropping, or just a feeling of presence. And the question is, what is that experience? We're going to come back to that kind of thing. What is this experience of communication between Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, the next world and this world? And what is their destiny? And perhaps most critically for us, what is our own destiny? Who doesn't wonder about that? And so the conversation that will emerge around what will exist of us is primarily, but not solely, we're going to come back to Seymour's question from last week about the corporeality, the realm of physicality in the next world, but is primarily understood as a world of souls. Okay, and we learn here in Chassidut, in the Hasidic teachings, that there's 5 types of souls. There's 5 levels to our souls. You ever heard this before? There's 5. So there's these 5 levels, and they're called Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechidah. Okay, so first is Nefesh. Nefesh is the lowest form. We actually see something somewhat similar in Aristotle. Aristotle talks about a 3-level plane, and the Talmudists are wrestling a little bit with that idea, but it goes further here. Nefesh is the life force inside each human, it's explained. This is the awareness of our physical world, the awareness of the physical body. It's what they call asiyah, the world of action. That's how we relate. We spend most of our day in the sense of nefesh. We see in Genesis 2:7, in the beginning of the Torah, that God breathed the nefesh into the human body. That's what made someone alive. They had nefesh. They have physical life. Then we see ruach. Ruach is explained primarily, no, not like clapping on Shabbos, although that's nice, but the emotions of the human condition, the love and awe of God, the avodah shebalev, the toil of the heart. This is sort of like an elevated, a slight elevation of the physical state. And then we have neshama. We're all familiar with this idea of neshama, and this is explained different ways, but primarily as the intellectual experience of the self or of the soul, and it's how we conceptualize of certain core truths and principles. Okay, so those are the basic 3, and then the Kabbalah goes a step further. It says first there's chaya. Chaya comes from chai, from life, and this is a state of communion with the Creator. This is a state where the first 3 are nullified, in a sense, where one taps into divine energy and loses a little bit of that self-identity and that human experience, and then ultimately to yechidah, which comes from yichud, or echad, meaning oneness, where one enters into the pure and transcendent world, cleaving to the original light, the Or Ein Sof, this original light. And that ultimately is explained as part of the movement towards the next world, that one is moving towards this light, this infinite light. And that is achieved through devekut. Devekut means a clinging or a approach towards the divine. And the question is raised here of how that's achieved. That ultimately, going back to the candle analogy, that there is this bonfire and sparks are sent off or descended into this world and landed into human form. And the role of that spark is that it wants to return to its source. And that these souls are a part of God, and they descend. And the goal, why do they descend into the world, these sparks inside of us? Because they want to be upgraded. They want to return back, the teachers explain, they want to return back to their source, but refined. They want, as a refined spiritual experience and having refined the world. That will come back to the notion of reincarnation next week. This sense of the spark coming off and returning in order that it becomes upgraded. And just on this point, we see in Mishlei, in Proverbs 20:27, this famous quote, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. that the soul of man is a lamp of God. That is to say, and this is a very important theological idea, that this world is darkness. This is a world of choshech. And the way that God sees in this world, right, that almost feels like a strange question, like how does God see in this world, is through the light of the souls of humanity, right? That this is only a world of darkness. God does what's called tzimtzum, retracts God's self from this world. So God is not here. That's what enables free will. If God was only here, like in the beginning of the Torah, where God seems everywhere, then we would have no free will. So God does tzimtzum and pulls God's self out of the world. Now there's all this free will and the problem of evil. And now God's the light in the world comes from the fact that these sparks are in humanity, and that's sort of God's vision, so to speak, in this world. And lastly, in terms of reward punishment on this point, is that as these sparks come off from the source, the question is, how do they get back to the source? And that's the painful part. That if one has reached yechidah, this communion, if one has transcended just this physical world and achieved a certain spiritual enlightenment in this world, then returning to the source is quite easy, right? But if it's become difficult, then it's a very painful transition from this world back to the source. And that's part of how we come to understand this notion of a hell, this notion of the pain of removing ourselves from the physical attachments we've become so connected to. And that's why the Kabbalists are teaching the work of this world is yechidah, to learn how to remove ourselves from this world of it, to attach back above. Okay? So if we turn to the second side, one exploration of this topic of heaven, which works with the idea we're sharing now, comes from the great scholar Gershon Shalom. Anyone heard of him? Gershon Shalom was, in a certain era, about the greatest thinker of Chassidut and Kabbalah. And he offers an interpretation of the Zohar here, and he gives an analogy, which is quite simple. A king has a son whom he sends to a village to be educated until he shall have been initiated into the ways of the palace. When the king is informed that his son is now come to maturity, the king sends the matron, his mother, to bring him back to the palace. And there the king rejoices with him every day. The village people weep for the departure of the king's son from among them, but one wise man said to them, "Why do you weep? Was this not the king's son, whose true place is in his father's palace and not with you?" How do you understand this metaphor?
It's when someone dies, they go back to heaven up to...
Right. And right, so that this life is training, right? This life is training, and that death, when life is lived well, is a celebration according to this idea. That other ideas will see death as purely tragic, but here it is a celebration because one is entering a process of reunification. And we'll see as many people mourn differently, and many people experience end of life very differently, not only their own end of life, but those of people they love. And in this analogy, if one has lived well, that one celebrates somebody returning to the palace to a certain degree. So this is an idea we're going to come back to, but this is an interesting explanation that we just saw earlier, and we'll see again this notion that we're sent to be educated in order that it's refined and it returns to a source. Now, something very confusing happens in the Gemara of Ketubot, this next source, which is based upon the 42nd chapter of Isaiah. And here we get into particularism. Now, these sources are constantly going from universalism to particularism. Particularism means Jewish sources about Jews and about a Jewish type of afterlife, as opposed to a human exploration of the human condition and this sort of universalistic notion of a world to come. And we see here in this tractate of the Talmud that the quote is brought, "and spirit to them that work therein," from Isaiah. And this teaches that Rav Yirmiyah ben Abba, in the name of Rav Yochanan, that whoever walks 4 cubits in the land of Israel is assured of a place in the world to come. Somebody who walks 4 cubits. Now, according to Rav Eliezer, would not the righteous outside the land be revived? Rav Elai replied, they will be revived by rolling to the land of Israel. Now the rabbis that talk about it tend to be humorous. Sometimes they're very serious, but sometimes they're also very playful. So you could almost imagine this, like, oh, what about all the great people outside of Israel? And he says, oh, they're going to roll back, right? Like they're going to do somersaults across the world. Will not the rolling be painful to the righteous? Abaye replies, cavities will be made for them underground, right? It's like they're imagining this world where there's these tunnels, right? There's these tunnels under the Pacific, and all the righteous are rolling in somersaults in these tunnels. But ultimately, this idea that they're bringing here, which we see frequently, and it's really attached from a political notion of Zionism, but this sense that it is through Israel, conceptually, I mean, there is a spatial and a temporal plane to Israel, but primarily, conceptually, this idea of Israel is the access point. And the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, will understand this as a reality, that there is a uniqueness to this one place in the world. It really is the sort of light, as we see in the book of Isaiah, the Or L'Goyim, the light unto the nations, which comes from Israel. And they understand it as true. However, others understand it a bit more metaphorically, and really in the sense that Israel represents something conceptually. But I think the most positive one is that no person on their own merits the true reward that's possible. And yet, when we rely upon the greats, that reliance is what gets us there. Right? We talked last time about saying Kaddish. How Kaddish for someone helps to elevate them. On their own merits, they might not get where they can get. But so too here, we're always praying in the name of the Avot and the Imahot, right? The fathers and the foremothers, right? Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, right? We're always saying, oh, because of the merits of them, give us, and in our prayers, especially in high holidays, we're always saying, not for our good deeds, but for the good deeds of our forefathers. So too, this is the claim of Israel, that we have this place, and we're going to use that as a channel, so to speak, to enable us to a higher plane. It's called Zchut Avot, and here we see this idea of the importance of Israel. Now, this is the source for the importance of being buried in Israel. This is why many ultimately choose to be buried in Israel rather than in the diaspora. And this is why many use the sand of Israel over their body. After the Chevra Kadisha cleans the body, and they pour some of the dirt or sand from Israel, so they have that attachment, or some clay. They'll put the clay over the eyes. If anyone's ever been a part of Chevra Kadisha, so somebody has. But then again, we see this other idea that in the time of a Messiah, that these people will return anyways. So that becomes a great debate. Is it just a nice thing, or is it an obligation ultimately to be in Israel? Okay. So moving forward to Pirkei Avot, we see two key explanations here as we return to this question of, does Judaism prioritize this world or the next? And firstly, we see in the 4th chapter, in the 21st section, a very famous idea. Rav Yaakov said, this world is like a vestibule, what in Hebrew is called a prosdor, a banquet hall, almost like, before the world to come. Prepare yourself in the vestibule so that you may enter the banquet hall. And so according to this line of thought, we've already seen it tonight and last time, that this world is only important in that it's a preparation for the next world. And that point gets brought up over and over according to Hasidic teachers and to teachers of Musar, of ethical development, to say, don't think that your bank account or your physical pleasure or the physicality of this world, buy every possible type of insurance you can buy as if you're never going to die. Don't think this is the end. It's merely preparation for the next world. And yet we see in the next bit, in 22, that he used to say, this is the same Rav Yaakov, 1 hour spent in repentance and good deeds in this world is better than the whole life of the world to come. Yet 1 hour of satisfaction in the world to come is better than a whole life of this world. So here we see the idea that this world has more importance. Why? Because here is the sole determination of what happens next. Right? As was shared earlier, in this world we have free will. And because we have free will in this world, the entire eternity of the next world, according to these sources, is dependent upon the choices we made in this world when we were still free. And the Kabbalah understands this as comparing humans to animals and to angels, and explains that angels and animals have no free will. Why not? Well, because animals only listen to their instinct, right? And they are slaves to the instinct. There is no free choice, according to this line of thinking. And angels have no free will also. They merely obey God. Right? So one follows their instinct, their animalistic instinct, and one merely obeys God. Humans have the animalistic instinct and the angelic potential in them. And there's this war between us. Am I an angel? Am I an animal? There is that war. And in this world, we're separated. And in the next world, one moves into that animalistic state or into the angelic state, based on what they embraced. In the angelic state, one has lost their free will. Again, they're sitting in divine splendor at the table with the crown on the head. Or they're in animalistic state, embedded in sort of a more painful experience like an animal has. Always hungry, never satiated, never understanding, always being hunted. In an animalistic type state that many humans, unfortunately, tend to live in. And so we see here this tension between the next world being more important, but this world being more important because it ultimately determines the eternity. Going 7 sections later, the source isn't on here, but in Pirkei Avot 429, we see that we will have to give account for our lives and to defend ourselves at the gates of heaven for how we embrace this concept. Anyone ever seen the movie Defending Your Life? If you haven't seen it, check it out on Netflix, or does Blockbuster still exist? Wherever you can get Defending Your Life. It's this great movie where this guy is defending his life in this next world and in front of a court, and then he's transformed in that world, in that trial state as well. And anyways, it's not incredibly insightful. It's just it's sort of playful and makes you think about certain things. So that's the notion in Pirkei Avot. Again, this is not the only idea. We're going to see this challenge later, but the idea that it's not eat, drink, and be merry, even though that comes from Kehilath, Ecclesiastes, not Dave Matthews. What's that?
Both are really good sources.
Yes.
I'll go with you.
But ultimately that we should be at least very aware of where we're going, and at most our lives guided by that reality. Now, the Likutei Moharan. Anyone know who wrote this? Likutei Moharan is written by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. You heard of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov? So he was from Uman in the 18th century, and he only lived to 38 years old, which is pretty amazing. Unfortunately, if you're in Israel, there's a lot of graffiti up now. The graffiti represents this phrase that the Breslovers want us to recite in order that Rabbi Nachman will sort of help to usher in a Messianic age. The two most popular Hasidic groups today are Lubavitch, which is really the most powerful Jewish group around today. And the states were like, is it Reform, Conservative, Orthodox? Globally, Lubavitch Chabad has dominated the scene. I mean, they have a center in every country in the world, practically. So them, and then the Breslovers. The Breslovers, you'll notice them, they're wearing these white caps over their heads. It'll have letters across. And their whole thing is that liot besimcha. That mitzvah gadola liot besimcha. The greatest mitzvah is to live in joy. And so their whole thing is about singing and dancing and being ecstatic. If you see them pray, they're dancing like crazy. It's really a very interesting community. And he's also our famous song. What's the famous song?
The world is a
yes, yeah. How does it start? Kol halam kulo, gesher tsar meyo. Right. This is Rabbi Nachman, and he has two types of teachings: really, really simple ones, and really, really complex ones. Ones that you learn it and you're like, the world is about joy, the world is about dancing, the world is, and other ones that are really sort of esoteric. Anyways, what Rabbi Nachman says here, and I'll let you decide if this is a simple or complex one, he says, this aspect of always being mindful of the world to come, i.e. of fixing one's thoughts on the world to come, applies in the general and in the particular. In the general, this is how a God-fearing person ought to act. Right when he gets up in the morning, before beginning anything at all, he should immediately remind himself of the world to come. Try this tomorrow morning. I mean, if this doesn't freak you out. Right when you wake up, say to yourself, there is a world to come. There is something perhaps after this. Perhaps. Like, see how that affects. And he brings this, we know this idea from Pirkei Avot already, that the way we should live is to always remember where we came from and to where we're going. And then he goes on, afterwards he should do this in the particular. This entire world is an enclothing of the lower levels of holiness, i.e. the aspect of the feet of holiness, as it is written, and the earth is my footstool, even though from the upper levels of holiness this is likewise a manifestation in this world. However, in this world the manifestation is not enclosed in the essence, but is only the radiance that shines in the aspect of the feet. So I would suggest this first paragraph is a simple teaching, and the second is a complex teaching. And what he's ultimately saying here is we live in a fake world. This is a fake world. It's a mask. It's not real. It's merely a footstool, so to speak. People remember Plato's cave? Right? In Plato's cave, most of the people are sitting in darkness in a cave, and they're worshiping these shadows on the wall of the cave. And they just love it. They love to be in darkness and just looking at this. And anyone who has the courage walks out into the light, which is scary, and sees the actual images, which is making the shadows on the cave. And so Rabbi Nachman says we live in a fake world where people really are accepting fake images. And that if anyone has the courage to step out and look at that Olam Haba, that next world, and see that light and see the see the true images. Okay, in the next text of the Mesilas Yesharim, this is if you ever come here from Mincha and Mariv in afternoons, this is the book I've been teaching between the afternoon service and the night service. And interesting, Rabbi Nachman died at 38 years old. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto from Amsterdam of the early 18th century passed away at 39 years old. This was a common thing for Kabbalists, that it's explained that certain Kabbalistic minds often died in their late 30s, because they had achieved too much, so to speak. That's oftentimes how it's explained. You ever read these books on Jewish meditation by Aryeh Kaplan? The great books on meditation. And he passed away in his late 30s. I think he wrote like 15 or 20 books before, by that point already around Kabbalah. And it's the most accessible works, Aryeh Kaplan, if you want to check those out. Anyways, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, if anyone was a student of Rav Margulies, Rabbi Margulies, he wrote on Luzzatto's, not his brother, a relative of his, Shmuel Luzzatto. Okay, anyways, here's what the Mesilas Yesharim wants to say in his first chapter. This goes along with the line we've been suggesting already, but again is not the only idea. Man was created solely in order to delight in God and derive pleasure from the glory of his presence, which is the truest delight and the greatest possible pleasure. And the place of this pleasure is truly the world to come, for it was created with that very design. But the way to arrive at this, our desired destination, is the present world. As our rabbis of blessed memory said, this world is like a corridor to the next, right? We just saw this in Pirkei Avot, right? It's a prose door. And the means by which bring a man to this end are the mitzvot, which were commanded to us by God. So his claim is that the commandments are tickets to Olam Haba. These ethical and spiritual practices are keys to try to get there. It's not like, you'll meet like, you often hear like agnostics say something like, I think everyone should just be good people. Right? As long as everyone's a good person, there's a place in the world to come. It's like, like sort of the lowest level of thinking. Like, okay, everyone's good, everyone goes to heaven. Right? I don't mean to put it down as much as saying like, okay, well, what is good? All right, we have to have an understanding of what the good is, and have an understanding of what that place is that is achieved and what's necessary. So his claim, and one can make other claims, is that it's these, that if there was a revelation, that revelation gave us a gift, and that gift was an elevated way to live in this world, and that would help us to achieve a pleasure in the next. That's his claim. And the only place where mitzvot may be fulfilled is in the present world. Now the Holy One has put man in a place where there are many who would distance himself from God. Such are those very physical lusts, which if he should tend after them, he would be removing himself continuously from the absolute good. It follows that he is really in the midst of a great battle. We'll come back to this point. For all the events of the world, for better or for worse, are moral trials, nisyonot. Poverty on the one hand and wealth on the other, as Shlomo said in Mishlei, in Proverbs. Lest I grow satisfied, for then I might deny, saying, who is God? And lest I become impoverished, for then I might steal. Thus the prospects of contentment on the one hand and suffering on the other mean that the battle is upon humanity from the front as well as from the rear. And so what he challenges us to see, and it's hard to embrace if one lives in relative comfort, One is not tremendously sick, one is not tremendously poor, one is mostly comfortable and content with life. He says we forget that we live in a battle. There is a battlefield and we're on it, and if we forget that we're on that battlefield, we will be swept away by our animalistic instinct, and that we must remember that we are ultimately in a world of tests. We're constantly being tested to see if we overcome certain battles. So the Mesilas Yesharim once again explains that it's really about the next world, but this world is needed to get there. Now, to return to a great question that was asked right when we walked in, where are these rabbis getting their ideas from? All these range of positions, where are they getting this from? And there's really three sources. One is textual, the second is spiritual, and the third is intellectual. Once again, nobody knows anything, right? As humans and not being gods, right? Richard Joel, the president of YU, I heard once said, I thought very profoundly, and you know, this is not meant to diss an atheist. It's morally a clever way of saying something that he feels, which is that the moral failure of an atheist is that they don't realize that the job of God is taken. Right? The moral failure of an atheist, they don't realize the job of God is taken, and thus there's a place for me maybe to take part of that role. Right? If I acknowledge whatever that is, there's something above me, it can't be me. Right? The basis of humility says I'm not in control of this world, I'm ultimately not God, there's something greater than me. And thus, that's how he embraces sort of the potential problem. Now, don't get me wrong. There's moral failures of people who believe in God as well, in serious ways. So there is no certainty from these sources and ideas, but they believe through these three access points they can get a grasp. Firstly, how to read the Torah. Secondly, how to understand the oral tradition. That's the textual approach. We keep seeing text being brought up. Secondly is from a spiritual place. Those who embrace a Kabbalistic type of prayer and meditation believe there's a revelatory experience, something less than a prophecy, but a grasping of a certain olam haneshamot, a world of souls. And thirdly, from reason and from logic. People like Rambam, Maimonides, are going to enter this conversation from a place of what they believe to be logic and reason in terms of how things are derived. So those are the main three places these rabbis are getting their thinking from. And, anyways, it's more than just sort of a place of desire. I want the next world to look like this, and thus it is. It would really make me happy for the next world. I was eating strawberries and, sitting next to my best friend from high school. Well, it's nice that we want it. But they ultimately want us to break away from a dreamland and return to a sort of an intellectual and spiritual rigor to discover that. Now, there's Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was a great 20th century Eastern European rabbi who later moved to Germany and was part of Hildesheimer, a great modern enlightened rabbinical school at the time in Germany. And then he ultimately ended up in Switzerland for a number of complex reasons. And this is too long, I'm not going to read this. I just want to read the first line and then another line somewhere else. I encourage you to read it later. This comes from Harav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Mishnato B'Shitato, an article he wrote about Rav Hirsch, who was a great German rabbi. And he opens up saying, the Israelite religion does not wish to uproot the Jew from the soil of his growth and transplant him elsewhere. And he's going to go on to make the case that we're not a religion of isolation onto the hilltop of meditation, into eternal bliss, but rather that this religion is deeply engaged with this physical world and not trying to escape it. And if there is any reward to come after this world, it's not about having evaded this existence as much as having toiled in it properly. If you go to the third paragraph, where it starts with the concept, 6 lines from the bottom, he goes on, the concept secular life, which is foreign to the spirit of Israel, came into being during those dark times. What he's understanding is Haskalah, the Enlightenment. The religious sense no longer drew sustenance directly from life and was sustained only by the fear of death and terror of the severe penalties of the world to come. So what he wants to say here, he's going to go on with his whole view of intellectual history of Jewish theology, is ultimately that the lowest level of somebody who's hanging on to the thread of a connection to Judaism says, well, I believe there's something in the next world, and some little fear of that keeps me somewhat connected. And he says, that has moved us to a focus on the next world and has lost the power of Judaism to be transformational and transcendental in this world. It moves us into what some will call childish religion. I'm in this for reward and punishment. Right? Am I gaining from being a part of religion? Am I losing? What's my reward? What's my punishment? This is the idea of like only showing up for Yom Kippur because I'm going to be struck down if I don't go to Yom Kippur or something like that. But rather, he makes the case that this is what happened in Enlightenment, that people become secularized and they only hold on to religion as a notion that, of a fear of the next world. Okay, lastly for this packet, and perhaps the most important source, I think, is from Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik was a 20th century rabbi. He was the great Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Yeshiva University. And one of his amazing works, if you're willing to invest the time in learning some new language, is called Halachic Man, Ish Halacha. And I actually read this under a lantern in an African desert, late at night as about 20 little Ghanaian children just stared at me, wondering what I was doing. And eventually, and sometimes pinching my skin while I was reading this book, just so intrigued at what I was doing. So it has a special place in my heart, this book. But that story is for another time. And he wants to compare here halachic man with religious man. And here's what he says. He says, the difference between a halachic man and religious man is essentially one of orientation. They move in opposite directions. Religious man starts from this world and concludes in Atzilut, which means the highest metaphysical realm, or heaven, so to speak. Halachic man, meaning one concerned with tradition, one who is involved with law and custom and a part of structuring their life according to ideals, begins in Atzilut and concludes in this world. Religious man aspires to ascend from the vale of tears of actuality, to escape the straits of sensed existence, into the divine expanses of transcendental existence, purged and distilled. Halachic man yearns to bring transcendentality into the valley of death of our world and to turn it into the land of life. While religious man throbs with the pining for flight from reality, halachic man derives a line in the sand of this world and does not leave it. He wishes to purify this world, not to flee from it. Flight heralds defeat. Halachic man is possessed of a stiffness of neck, a tremendous stubbornness. He battles the evil and the demonic forces of life and struggles valiantly against the rule of malice and the hosts of wickedness in the world. Here's the most important line. His mission is directed not towards running away to another world, which is all perfect, but rather to lower that eternal world into ours. And so what Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying here is that religious man, so to speak, is this person who is consumed with this next world and believes that this world is all about trying to get there. He says, halachic man, meaning the person who is engaged in tradition, law, custom, Jewish ethics, and spirituality in a this worldly kind of way. The goal is not heaven, but to bring heaven down to earth. The goal is to take these pristine values and ideals and to live them in this world rather than longing for some actualization in the next world. And thus he believes that everything in our life should be geared towards this higher spiritual and ethical ends. And then there is a faith connected to that the right things will happen. But we shouldn't be consumed with that. Rather, we start from top and bring it down rather than the bottom and bring it up. Okay, so that's Rav Soloveitchik, a very important point. And I want to say on the second sheet 3 sources, and I'm going to skip the bottom 2, and you can look at those later just in the interest of time. So there's a little bit of a question and answer this time, and next time we'll get into pulling it all together. But the bottom 2 sources I want to skip are about people who are brought back to life. Both of these come from the book of Kings, the books of Malachim. This is a good time to make a pitch that on Wednesday morning we're learning the books of prophets over breakfast. It's only half hour, 7:45 to 8:15. We're in the book of Samuel now. Kings is next. Anyways, over there, Elisha brings somebody back to life, and Elijah brings somebody back to life. And so there is this idea, and we'll come back to this notion that people die and come back. We see this throughout the prophets. Anyways, the first 3 sources. First, we see from the book of Eov, the book of Job. Wonderful book, by the way, about evil, good and evil, about human suffering, traumas and glories. And this is a source that's quoted often. It says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then from my flesh shall I see God. Now, like every verse, that's impossible to understand, and you could interpret it a lot of different ways. But generally, it's understood as we will enter a fleshless existence, right? After my skin has been destroyed, then from my flesh shall I see God. Not with my flesh, but from moving away from a realm of flesh, I will see God. And here we get into an important point of distinction, which came up last time, around will this heaven, so to speak, be a physical or a spiritual realm? And to be sure, the dominant thrust is that it is a physical, that there is a physical realm. We saw this in the Gemara of Brachot last time, that we will sit with physical bodies with crowns on our heads, and we will lose certain emotions and desires, but we will have this bodily existence. We saw that in Brachot 17a. Then in Ketubot 111b, we see this idea that trees will produce fruit after only 1 month, and Israel will produce the finest grain and wool. And then, here's a fascinating one, of a Talmudic explanation of heaven. In Shabbat 30b, it says, women will bear children daily.
Really?
Right? No, that's supposed to be a blessing. That's supposed to be a blessing. And trees will produce fruit daily. So this is a very strange idea to understand. But this idea that one of the greatest rewards that would be given, at least for women, although I wouldn't mind having this reward. I'm very jealous of my wife. Not always, but this idea is a pretty amazing idea. That women will bear children daily, and this is in Shabbat 30b. So those texts are showing there is very much a physical existence in the next world. And that has to do with relationships. It has to do with physical pleasure in this way and this way and that. Then we see, on the other hand, that what the Rambam calls Olam HaNeshamos, that a world of souls, or a Gan Eden, a Garden of Eden, which is only about a spiritual existence without bodies. And this is the point where one would only connect to a loved one if they had that spiritual connection. That is to say, I guess today what we call a soulmate, right? That if one only loved someone on sort of a physical type way, there would be no relationship left in that Olam HaNeshamos, this land of the souls. But if one had a true soul connection, then that remains. Okay, these other two sources, then one of the main notions of hell comes from Ezekiel, the book of the prophet of Ezekiel, or Yechezkel, and it says, I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit, or the bowl, the people of old. I shall set you in the lowest parts of the earth. Anyone read, what's that book we read a year ago? The book that everyone's read, the Italian... Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno, this incredible creativity of these different levels of hell. It's humorous and terrifying at the same time. And he says, with those who go down to the pit, and shall not be inhabited, shall not radiate splendor in the land of living. We're going to explore this more next time, the idea of Sheol and Gehenna, these notions of hell and Jewish thought, which are very unique. And then the last source I want to bring tonight is this question of, is this heaven and hell, is this reward and punishment only based upon us or based upon others as well? And what's the bracha, what's the blessing one says at a bar bat mitzvah? It's called Shep Tarani, right? Shep Tarani, the blessed one is saying when a girl turns 12 or a boy turns 13, is, God, no longer am I punished for the wrongs of this child. Right? It's sort of an intense thing to say, hey, Mazel Tov! We got killers out there. No longer am I punished for this person's silliness, right? So it's this one of the inspiring and confusing parts of the tradition. But actually, there's another interpretation of the Lavush. And the Lavush says what's really being said over there is no longer is the child punished for the wrongs of the parent. That up until they have their own free will, 12 and 13, I don't know if that's really adulthood, but up until then, they're really punished for their parents' wrongdoings. Anyways, what it says in Yechezkel is, the person who sins, he alone shall die. A child shall not share the burden of a parent's guilt, nor shall a parent share the burden of a child's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous shall be accounted to him alone, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be accounted to him alone. That Yechezkel is quoted all the time to say, at the end of the day, who our kids are, who our parents are, is irrelevant. We all stand before the Creator on our own. However, this contradicts the book of Exodus. In Exodus 34:7, it says, Poked avon avot abanim, that God will visit the sins of parents upon the children. It's actually interesting. When we say slichot, this penitential prayer asking for God's mercy, the 13 attributes of mercy, there's a part of the verse that's left out. Right? We say all this beautiful, merciful part. God is kel rachum v'chanun. Right? God is this merciful being. And then we leave out this last part. Poked avot abanim. That God will visit the sins of parents upon kids. It makes sense why we leave it out. But here we see this contradiction. That in the book of Exodus it says, no, actually, the way your parents lived affect your cosmic destiny. Affect your eschatology. And the way your kids live and your grandkids live also affect your role in the world to come. But then we see Yechezkel, no, and that's a later development. Yechezkel can't imagine as a prophet the possibility that we all aren't judged upon our own merits. Okay, that's all I want to say with sources. Let me give one idea, and then I'm going to close with the source sheets, and we'll take some closing thoughts and questions. Which is the question of when does Olam Haba happen? When does the next world happen? And there's a couple views here. One view is, which is sort of the conventional understanding, a person dies, and then they go to Olam Haba, right? Someone dies, they go to the afterlife, right? That's one idea that is seen in the sources. The second idea is that there's a year of purgatory, right? This is the notion of Kaddish, right? Why do we say 11 months? I might have said this last time. We say 11 months of Kaddish, not 12 months, because, well, actually, that's only true if the person was righteous. If the person was truly wicked, you're supposed to say the full 12 months of Kaddish. Because the idea is that we leave off the last month because we think it's their own merits that will get them there. It's our voting confidence of them. Hey, Abba, you did great. I'm not going to say Kaddish last month. You're doing okay on your own, right? But the 11 months, they need our help a little bit. Okay, so the idea is there's a purgatory, there's a holding cell, there's a transition. Again, the water has to go through the filter. I just made that up. But the water has to go through the filter. The spark has to be purified to return back to its to the bonfire in order to get to this ultimate Olam Haba. So one place, you go there immediately. The second idea is that there's this purgatory, there's transition. The third idea, and here's the two main ideas. Firstly is that all are held. Right? Like Einstein and Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and Adam and Eve are all in this holding place right now, and they're all held there until this world is destroyed. And once this world is destroyed, then we enter this new world, via a messianic era, and then there's the Olam HaTechiyah, a physical resurrection, and all of those souls that have been out there and hanging and waiting there's a resurrection, and then there's a next world, right? Messianic era is separate from Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and Olam Haba, the next world, and all these souls are in this holding place until they can ultimately get that bodily resurrection and return to a bodily place of the next world, a physical existence. And lastly is the idea that afterlife, people are held spiritually. Then is Yemei Mashiach, the Messianic era, where the bodies return. There's the resurrection for the Messianic days. And then is Olam Haba, the afterlife, which is a soul existence, a spiritual existence without the bodies. Okay? So again, in one model, the afterlife is really a physical existence, and then it evolves into a spiritual existence. The other model, it's a spiritual existence and evolves into a physical experience. Does it go from Olam HaTechiyah, a resurrection world, to an Olam HaNeshamas, to a soul world, or the opposite, a world of souls going to a world of physical resurrection? So I want to pause there, and I'm not going to attempt to sum all that up right now. But we saw a whole range of things of what is this next world, a couple of views. When does it begin? And who has the opportunity to get there? We're going to come back to that point. But also, what's the importance of this world versus the next? And we saw one idea which says this world is, in a sense, more this world is less important, and we should wake up meditating on the fact that ultimately we're just going through a preparation, a training course for eternity. And this other view that says, whoa, forget that. Bring those ideals down and make this world the full center of our focus and attention. And then only through a level of faith, but not of intentional contemplation and meditation, do we access that next world. So let's pause there. And